Common Core today, and we're going to start off with Dr. Duke Pesta explaining a little bit what Common Core is.
Yeah, that's a hugely complicated question. I've worked on a really good soundbite version, though. Common Core, basically, there's two things to it, two major points to it. Number one, it is a huge federal intrusion into public education. The feds have been taking over more and more control for at least the last 30 years, but this marks the biggest move yet to take away real local control from families and from school districts and to centralize education. I like to compare it to Obamacare in some ways. It's going to centralize education the way healthcare is being centralized now at the national level by the healthcare law. That's the first problem, is the shocking degree to which the feds are appropriating education and making it more and more difficult for moms and dads to have a meaningful say. The second biggest problem, the second part of this, that is the real issue, is that once the feds have this power, they always use it to promote ideology, to use the classroom in this instance to politicize education in ways way beyond the many ways that it already has been politicized. Again, we've seen this kind of politicization, the leftist bias of education for 20, 30 years now, and this is going to make that much worse. They're already using these federal channels that they've opened up to import all sorts of things into the classroom that have really nothing to do with ABCs or 1, 2, 3s.
So let me ask you, just getting into the structure of this and who actually created this Common Core?
Well, it's a broad network. It's initially two Washington lobbyist groups are responsible, and I like to call them front groups. They have received a lot of money, a lot of support, a lot of backing from the Department of Education. Arne Duncan, one of the things Obama did when he became president was appointed arguably the worst Secretary of Education in American history, a man by the name of Arne Duncan, who has been a lapdog for the president's agendas across the board. And two Washington lobbyist groups, the National Governors Association and the CCSSO, these two groups, and I want to caution your audience, when you hear National Governors Association, that does not mean 50 state governors locking themselves into a room and banging out education standards. The NGA is a lobbying group that puts politicians, governors, and their aides in touch with lobbyists. So two major lobbyist groups, both of them with very little educational background, were given millions and millions of dollars, in fact billions. As we sit here today, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has been the primary private supporter of Common Core, and they've funneled billions of dollars into groups, including these two lobbyist groups, to create these standards behind closed doors. So you have basically the federal government working in partnership with private corporate entities to put together an educational framework that seeds all sorts of money to the corporate sponsors through testing, through the high costs of textbook replacement, all that. So the corporatists get money out of this, and the feds get, of course, control.
So the National Governors Association, they're not governors at all. They're just a lobbying group that was
right. And some governors have been approached about this. One of the things that drives me nuts about the Common Core debate is you've got Republicans, including most vocally Jeb Bush and then John Kasich of Ohio, two Republican governor and former governor, who are big cheerleaders for this. Kasich actually comes out and says that the state governors wrote Common Core. It is a categorical lie. No governor wrote any part of it. No governor's aide or staff wrote any part of this. It's simply by allowing the NGA, the National Governors Association, the lobbying wing of this organization, to take money and to help sponsor those who wrote the standards. You get Republicans, Chris Christie's another one, making arguments that somehow this was a governor's initiative or it was state-led, and that's absolutely not true.
Now, are any of these people qualified to write education programs?
One of the shocking things about this is the lack of qualification. The chief architect of Common Core, the man most responsible for it, is a fellow by the name of David Coleman, Coleman. David Coleman has been called on his own Wikipedia page the chief architect of Common Core. David Coleman doesn't have a single degree in education. He has never taught in a classroom. He has done no educational research. He has no qualifications. David Coleman took money initially from the Gates people to work in these lobbyist groups, the NGA and the CCSSO, put together a small committee of people who wrote these standards. This is the really shocking thing. No sooner did David Coleman oversee the writing of the Common Core standards in English and math than he immediately left the Common Core committee. He is now the president of the college boards, where he is rewriting the SATs, the exams that your kids have to take to get into college. He's rewriting the SATs to conform to his Common Core standards. So the same inexperienced, unqualified individual who wrote the standards, oversaw the writing of the standards, miraculously ends up as the president of the college boards, where he is now in control of the standardized tests that your kids will take to get into college, and he is rewriting those to conform to his Common Core standards.
Now, does he have to rewrite these SATs because they're too hard right now, and he has to bring them in line with Common Core to make them easier? Or, I mean, can the kids today learning Common Core take the SATs the way they stand and actually do well on them?
No, and the thing that he's dealing with is that you can't make a change like this and then expect the first generation of kids to be any good at it. You're testing high school seniors now. They've already radically changed the SAT. The ACT's following suit. You can't expect kids who are juniors, sophomores, juniors, and seniors in high school now. You can't expect them to score very well on a pure Common Core test because they didn't start taking it in kindergarten. So what the College Board is doing now is they are year by year making changes to the exams piece by piece. And in 5, 6, 7 years down the road, they will have it completely transformed as the first generation of kids from kindergarten all the way through moves through. That's why you are seeing this horrific testing now, and kids failing left and right, states refusing to release the test to the families, because you're going to have this. This radical transformation requires about 10 years to get a whole generation of kids through it. Meanwhile, they're still doing it. So you've got the kids who are taking the test now who have no idea how to do this. And these are the growing pains of Common Core. They've dug the infrastructure so deep. They've already made the substantive changes to textbooks, to teacher pedagogy. That's not going to change now. What the problem they're having is it's going to take about a generation to get enough kids steeped in Common Core to be able to do well on those ridiculous Common Core tests. So the window's closing, and that's what you see right now. What Coleman is doing is year by year amending the exams, bringing them more in line with Common Core, but trying to do it in a way that it's not obvious that these kids know less and are absolutely getting hammered in how they take these tests.
Now, were any teachers, professors, parents involved in creating this? Because you would think that would be a great group to go to get involved in creating standards for our children.
The standards are the product of this small committee, and there were some educators on the committee. It was a very small group. The fact is that at the state levels, no teachers, no professors, no moms and dads were ever consulted on any of this until after 46 states had accepted the standards. It is true that after 46 states accepted the standards, that local people at the state level got to see them. But when they got to see them after the states had taken them, they couldn't change them, they couldn't amend them, they couldn't reject them. So what happened is that this committee, with the help of the federal government, basically one big bribe. And this begs the question, it has to be answered now. Mm-hmm. How did the states then take them? Why did 46 states take them without really knowing what they were? And the answer is federal bribery. The federal government, Department of Education, in conjunction with Barack Obama, in 2009, his first year in presidency, they created the Federal Race to the Top program. Race to the Top was basically the federal government handing out billions of dollars to the states. That money went from the federal government directly to state departments of education. And all the states had to do to get the money was to accept the Common Core standards that they hadn't even seen yet. Most of the states that took Common Core through Race to the Top grants took it without ever having seen them. They weren't even written yet. So back in 2009, 2010, 2011, as the standards were being written, before anybody at the state level had seen them, the federal government encouraged every state in the union to apply for race to the top grants. Ultimately, when the dust had settled, 46 states took some form of money for race to the top, which obligated them legally to accept the Common Core standards when they were finally released. So after the states took the money, the feds created the grants, the feds took our taxpayer money, gave it right to state departments of education. And what state department of education in 2009 was going to say, no, we don't want your money? I'll give you an example. In 2009, New York became the first state to receive a federal Race to the Top grant. They took $700 million of taxpayer money from the feds. And the only meaningful point of taking that money was now that New York received that money, they were obligated to accept and incorporate the standards, which they did. And so after all that was done, some local state teachers and professors got to see the standards. And the irony is that once people saw them, well after they were already instituted, you've got the New York State Teachers Union, for instance, a very liberal organization. The New York State Teachers Union a few years ago condemned the standards and demanded they be removed. Of course, too little too late. The money had been taken, the standards had been implemented. It's really an interesting situation. Common Core is opposed almost as hard on the left as it is on the right. Major teachers unions all across the country, liberal organizations like the Chicago Teachers Union in Barack Obama's own backyard, radically oppose the standards. So it's one of those issues because of the way it was done, the illegality of this, the bribery, the relative secrecy and lack of teacher input in this has caused groups on the right and the left to really begin to oppose it. There's another group I should mention to you. There's a group of about 100,000, 150,000 teachers across the country. They have named themselves the Badass Teachers, the BATs, the BATs. And they have come together primarily to oppose Common Core. Now, the left doesn't always oppose it for the same reasons the right does. But I have not seen an issue in my lifetime that has brought people on the left and right together as much as this one has.
Can states right now back out of this? Is it possible for them to say, you know something, we don't want the testing, we don't want the standards, we're giving back the money, or they probably won't, but we're not doing this?
No, it's no longer possible. Some states have tried to get out, but every single state, give you an example, Indiana, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Louisiana's trying. The states that have quote-unquote tried to pull out really didn't pull out. Indiana, the first state in the union to pull out, to quote-unquote pull out, about 3 years ago, Mike Pence, Republican governor. What he did was, the outcry from Indiana educators and Indiana parents was so bad that Pence wanted to do something. He was killing him politically. But what he did was really deceptive. He said he pulled out of Common Core, then immediately turned the education standards for the state back over to the Indiana Department of Education. They kept 95% of what Common Core was and stamped it Indiana standards. And he claimed he fixed the problem. That's what happened in Oklahoma. See, the problem is that states really can't pull out. They took the money, all the tests were changed, and any state that tries to pull out now the feds have blackmailed and bribed them. Oklahoma tried this. Oklahoma wanted to pull out completely. Then the federal government said, okay, we can't stop you from pulling out of Common Core. But if you do, we'll withhold federal education dollars from your state. And that means you will have to go back to using No Child Left Behind, the previous set of standard-based initiatives. No Child Left Behind was a miserable disaster. And so Oklahoma was caught between a rock and a hard place. If you pull out, you're federally obligated to use No Child Left Behind, which was horrible. They didn't want to do that. If you opt out, you have to go back to that system. And if you do that, we'll also withhold federal funding from you. So no state in the union. Those 4 or 5 states have pulled out only to simply rebrand, to take Common Core, give it enough. Florida's another one. Florida now has the Sunshine State standards, which are basically just Common Core with a really stupid new name. And so that's what states have done. And I'll tell you, I live in Wisconsin. Governor Scott Walker, who's been a good governor, has been an absolute disaster on Common Core. He's trying to do the same thing. All the Republican governors are trying to rename it. They won't get rid of it because it's going to cost the states too much money. Then their own departments of education in the state go to war with them, which they don't want, because the liberal departments of education all want it because of the money that came attached to it. And so most Democrat governors took it. They don't care. They want it. They'll take the money. They believe in the liberal ideology that it represents. The Republican governors, who should know better, they talk a good talk about trying to get out of it, but all the best they've done is simply take it, rename it. Now, it is true, I should say, that some states are trying to minimize the damage of the testing. A number of states, Oklahoma, South Carolina, again, Florida, have pulled out of the major testing consortiums for Common Core, Smarter Balance and the PARCC testing. But the irony is when they've pulled out, with great fanfare, Governor Scott of Florida made a big deal about pulling Florida out of this ridiculously ideological SBAC testing, right? And what did he do? He turned testing in Florida over to a company called Air, which is infinitely worse than SBAC was. So a lot of these Republican governors are thumping their chest saying, well, and Governor Walker's another one, we've broken up the testing monopoly, because they argue that the testing is the problem. The only problem with Common Core, even these Republican governors are saying, is the ridiculous testing mechanisms. But the irony is, and anybody who's paying attention should know this is true, the real problem is not the testing. The testing's a nightmare. But it's what you're testing that's the problem. So you can go ahead and break up PARCC. You can go ahead and transfer money from one big testing conglomerate to another. You're not fixing the problem. The problem is the standards and the pedagogy and the way that the standards are being enforced in classrooms. That's the problem. You can test that bad system any way you want. It's still a bad system. So these governors who are attacking it and why are they attacking it through the testing? Because it's the easiest point of entry. It's the easiest point where Republicans, Democrats, liberals, and conservatives immediately see the problem of Common Core. So these governors think that by changing up the testing a little bit, it's really like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. By going after the testing, they score points, they make it look like they're doing something, but all they've really done is transfer the testing from one really bad group to a worse group. Meanwhile, the standards themselves go on unabated and destructively influencing our kids.
So let me add, from all this, who benefits from this? Like who, I know it came from the Gates Foundation. I mean, he put up a lot of money for this, and people are going, oh my God, look how much money he put up for this. You know, he wants education. He wants our children to do better. I mean, what is his real motivation for all of this?
Well, I would ask you this, your audience says, well, what is Bill Gates' qualification? You asked about qualifications. Mm-hmm. What qualifies Bill Gates? Isn't he the guy that dropped out of college because education wasn't cutting it for him and opened a company in his garage? What in the world qualifies Bill Gates to be involved this way? You mentioned the money. He's spent, as you sit here today, over $7 billion of his own money pushing Common Core. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if instead of the Gates billions, it was the evil Koch brothers who would put up $7 billion? The press would be screaming bloody murder. If a Republican billionaire, somebody like the Koch brothers, had gotten involved in education, had been this successful in funding this kind of transformation, the teachers unions, the Department of Education would be screaming bloody murder. What qualifies Bill Gates to do this? Nothing. He has no qualifications. But he's a big liberal billionaire philanthropist, so nobody says a word, right? He must have America's best interests at heart. It's ridiculous. You ask who benefits. Mm-hmm. Let me give you one example. It's been estimated that about 70% of American school districts, 70, are going to have to upgrade their computer capacity, their technology, their bandwidth, their technology to be able to implement the kind of tests that Common Core mandates. Whose computers do you think are going in those classrooms? It's not the Apple computers, right?
No.
And so you ask who benefits. So I had mentioned at the very opening that there are two parties responsible for this. You've got the federal government, who's funding much of this, who's using legislative and regulatory power to pressure, bribe, and blackmail states to take these standards and everything that goes with them. And then you have a small group of crony capitalist people, companies like the Gates Foundation, some of these major testing institutions, the textbook companies who are making billions rewriting all these textbooks and forcing schools to buy them. So you've got crony capitalism here. You've got the federal government who's the mastermind and controls all of this. And what do they get out of this? Power and control. And then you've got a small group of companies who are complicit with the feds in administering the tests, creating the textbooks, doing the teacher training. They're getting billions and billions of dollars in profit. The feds are getting all that control.
So does the federal government actually have a legal right to write the standards and do what they're doing?
Nope, this is illegal. We got the 10th Amendment to the American Constitution, first of all, which prohibits the federal government's meddling in state education decisions. And then you've also got 3 different statutes dating from 1965 at the federal level that prohibit the American federal government from creating national standards or a national curriculum. They cannot legally do it. That's why, now it makes sense, right? That's why they allowed these 2 lobbyist groups who have no real educational background to become the front organization to put this together, right? They couldn't do it, so they allowed these lobbyist groups to do it. Meanwhile, the only way Common Core could have been put in the schools is through the feds, and that was the Race to the Top application program. Now, we now have our first state governor, I don't know why it took this long, but Bobby Jindal in Louisiana is trying to sue the federal government because of the illegality of that process.
So, everyone's wondering, why do they want to push Common Core on our children? What is the point of it?
Well, there are 2 reasons. The first is regulatory and who controls what your kids learn. And that's the big deal. The feds do not like the fact. And really, without belaboring the point, you look at Obamacare. They don't like the fact that people can choose their own medical care. They don't like the fact that people can opt out of medical care. They don't like the fact that individual states, even individual hospitals, can offer different kind of services to different people. They don't like the fact that they can exclude people. Certain insurance plans can exclude people if they want to, or not cover everything the government says should be covered. So how do you fix that? You strip away local control of healthcare. You federalize, you regulate, you nationalize, you standardize healthcare. It gets worse. It gets more expensive. It becomes shoddier care, but it's centrally controlled. It's the same thing with education. The feds want kids to learn what the federal government thinks they should learn. And they're not getting that in all these different school districts. Not enough kids are learning about global warming. Not enough kids are learning that our founding fathers were racist monsters. Not enough kids are learning that homosexuality and gay marriage are completely normal and as regular as anything else. And so because the liberals, leftists have long recognized that whoever controls the children ultimately are going to be able to change the country. And so what Common Core represents, I've said this every talk I've given, the primary purpose of Common Core is not to educate your kids better. It is not to make them better readers. It's not to make them higher level mathematicians. It is to control what they learn, to centralize it and to politicize it. That is worth trillions to a federal government that wants to look out for its own interests. You want to grow up generations of kids, and let's be clear about this. If our kids learn only what the government wants them to learn about education, about the country, why is it that the younger demographics for the last 30 years, the younger the demographic, the more liberal they vote? The younger the demographic, the more anti-capitalist they are. The younger the demographic, the more pro-gay marriage they are. Why is this? They learned that somewhere. They haven't been learning it from their churches, and they haven't been learning it from their parents. They're learning it in the schools. Abraham Lincoln said, and he was exactly right, that the philosophy of the classroom in one generation becomes the philosophy of government in the next. And that's what Common Core represents.
Now, they keep telling us that this is a very rigorous, standard type of program. It's going to help us in the world of education. It's going to bring us our rankings back up. It's going to make America better, and our kids will be smarter. Is this really going to happen? Or
how could it possibly be true? Common Core has never. This kind of a system has never been tried before. It took 6 years. Common Core was conceived in 2008 and 2009. It was just this past spring of 2015, that kids got their first serious Common Core testing. How in the world could they have been telling you for 6 years that this was going to work, it was going to be wonderful, it was going to raise standards, when they hadn't even tested it yet? It was just tested the previous spring. The whole thing is a lie. It's never been benchmarked. There's no evidence it's going to work. As a matter of fact, we know from looking at the math standards that overall your kids are going to get a much lower math education than they had gotten previously.
So
this is somehow go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't.
The idea that this is somehow geared to make our kids better, that's how they had to sell it, right? But the same way they sold Obamacare. You're going to get better health care cheaper. You spent your whole life in finance. Does that ever work? You're going to get something much better cheaper. When does that ever work? And yet that's how they sold Obamacare. That's exactly how they're selling Common Core too. Think about how wonderful it's going to be when every kid in every school every day is learning exactly the same thing. Let me ask you this. You know the answer to this. You're going to get 60 million American school kids to exactly the same place. Is that going to ultimately have to be a higher place or a lower place if you're going to get 60 million kids there? It's going to have to be lower, isn't it? Yeah. And that's the standard here. Whenever you nationalize and standardize, you are spreading it so thin, you're competing with the least common denominator. This is the social justice aspect of Common Core. It's not fair that some kids get better educations than others. It's not fair that moms and dads who have money can help their kids more than other kids. So what we're going to do is we're going to create an educational system where every kid turns out exactly the same. And if you're going to do that, every kid is going to be pulled down, not pushed up.
So let me ask you, how is this going to affect the future of America? I mean, since they're, not learning what they have in the past, like we've learned, and they're learning completely something different, and they're going to be kind of dumbed down. What kind of jobs, what kind of creativity, what is going to come? I mean, are these just going to be drone workers, and that's it?
Absolutely, I think so. I mean, you think about it. The purpose of this, again, is not education. People ask me that all the time. Incredulous people say to me, "But aren't they aware that they're going to destroy entrepreneurship? Aren't they aware that they're going to create a generation of kids who can't look after themselves?" Of course, they're aware of it. A generation of kids who cannot make enough wealth to live a good life, a generation of kids who can't take care of themselves are going to have to cede their freedom to the government to take care of them. Generations of kids who cannot make it on their own like previous generations of American families have, where are they going to go to look for help? That generation is going to be profoundly happy to trade away their liberties and their freedoms for the kind of centralized help that the feds will give them. That, my friend, it's socialist, isn't it? Can we use that word? Isn't that what this is? That the central government it's not just healthcare. It's not just regulating the markets. It's not just this carbon tax boondoggle. This is now education, right? We are going to so regulate it and centralize it that we produce kids whose only resource is us, right? Whose only ultimate hope is they've been so badly educated about what liberty and freedom are. They've been taught to believe the country was founded illegally, that capitalism is an exploitative, wicked system. These kids are already being groomed to believe that big government is the answer for everything. And tell me it's not true. Look at our kids and grandkids. Look at how they vote. Look at what their attitudes are to who should look after them. Right? We've already created generations who believe that government should have that power. Now with Common Core, it's become institutionalized in our educational systems.
Now, when I speak to people about Common Core, they say, well, they had a committee, they looked at it, they said everything is fine, it's living up to what they expected. And how do you tell someone, like, well, no, the committee really didn't rule on this, or the committee was wrong? I mean, what do you say to people?
There's not much you can say. If somebody's attitude is that I trust my government implicitly, and if they say it's okay with me, then you see that person was clearly educated in the public schools. That person clearly has already bought what they've been selling. I don't think there's much you can do. I mean, until those families, and this is what has happened. I've met a lot of people like that 3 and 4 years ago. They're not thinking that way now. There were a lot of people 3 years ago who said exactly what you just said. Well, the governors did this, or committees looked at this, and now they're beginning to see what their kids are learning in school. Now they're beginning to see assignments that their kids are bringing home. Now they're beginning to see it's a problem. But if you've got somebody who doesn't have kids, or whose kids are through school already, or who doesn't pay any attention to what's going on in their kids, and that's most of America, isn't it? Most moms and dads aren't paying much attention to what their kids are doing in the classroom. That's how they get away with it. Until moms and dads see some of these assignments, until moms and dads suffer through this testing nonsense, they don't pay much attention. The good news, if there is any good news, I have never in my life seen something that has got moms and dads paying attention to education like Common Core is. Still too many, still far too few of them are paying attention. But more of them are paying attention now than in anything. I've been in education. I've been a professor for 22 years, and I've been involved with education for longer than that. In my lifetime, I have never seen parents upset about an educational thing like they are Common Core. Unfortunately, it's still maybe 1 in 10 moms and dads who even knows what it is? And that's why you lose these battles, because, well, they must know better. They had a committee, well, Bill Gates, like you said earlier, right? Well, Bill Gates, he must really care about education if he's going to spend all that kind of money. He's a smart guy. He wouldn't do anything to hurt the country, would he? That attitude, that's one of the reasons why the country is being transformed on a lot of levels.
So let me ask you this question. I was listening to some of your talks, and you mentioned the curriculum, and a lot of the curriculum has to do with sex ed at a very early age. And it looks like the government is taking over teaching our children things that we would normally teach them or not teach them until they're much older. Why are they intertwining sex into the curriculum?
Well, and this is the tough thing to talk about, because the national sexuality standards, the comprehensive sexuality reform, is not necessarily something that's mentioned in the initial Common Core standards. Common Core is a Trojan, whatever else it is, it's a Trojan horse that allows feds through regulation and control to bring a bunch of other stuff. Again, remember where we started. The two big problems were we're ceding too much control of our kids' education to federal entities, number one. And number two, those federal entities are now using that control to force stuff on our kids that we don't want. And a big part of that is sex, especially now with the landmark decision about gay marriage, right? You're going to see now, it's already been going on, but it will proceed apace now. Sex ed, gender ed, sexuality education, transgenderism now. It's not going to be anymore what it was when you and I were younger, where when you got to high school, maybe you got a little teaching in sex ed, maybe you had to sit through a health class. No. Now with Common Core as the Trojan horse, kids are going to be learning about homosexuality, about transgenderism, about all sorts of things now in English class, in history class, in social studies class, even in math and science now. Though all the subject areas are going to be transformed, it's less about mastery of content and knowledge and much more about social engineering. This is what's coming. And so sex is just one thing. There's nothing that the feds hate more than the abstinence programs. What they want and have been calling for years, if not decades, is comprehensive sexuality reform. That means you teach kids starting in kindergarten. You teach kids about their bodies. You give them sexual information. You have groups like Planned Parenthood coming into classrooms, helping to co-write textbooks that are mainstreaming sex, mainstreaming abortion, mainstreaming transgenderism to kids in elementary schools. That's what's now happening, because the feds now are in charge It's not just what we still have this, a lot of people our age still have this naive belief that moms and dads get to control morality, get to control theology, get to control the conscience of their children. They get to impart parental values into their kids. One of the main consequences of this huge nationalization of education is that the feds are now the primary arbiters of what your kids morally and how they learn it. Your kids are going to learn to be pro-homosexual. They're going to learn to be tolerant of transgenderism. They're going to learn to be shockingly sexualized at young ages. And by ceding this control to the federal government, you tell me what's coming down the road. Now that all of this is part of a national curriculum, now that all of this is going to be tested nationally, now that all the states in the union have given up their ability to control what goes on in their classrooms, deferred to these national standards, what's going to happen when you as a mom and dad teach your children in 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade that marriage is between a man and a woman, and your 5th grader goes to a typical public school classroom and encounters the opposite worldview? Who do you think is going to win that battle now? And by the way, you're telling me that if the federal government, to give one example, is mainstreaming gay marriage, homosexual marriage, as young as kindergarten, and your family opposes it for religious reasons, tell me that's not cause now for some state or federal entity to come and take those kids away or come and challenge. Somebody's bullying those kids, right? Because we have a standard now. And that standard is as much about sexuality, it's as much as about social justice, it's as much anti-capitalism. Global warming, right? The degree to which at 5 years old and 6 years old and 8-year-old, your kids are going to be bombarded with one-sided arguments about global warming now. At the federal level, in the classroom, they're going to be tested on that. What possible way are you going to be able to teach them something else now? And if you do manage to incorporate other worldviews into your kids' education, what happens when those worldviews in the classroom bump into the standard national one? Who do you think is going to win that battle?
So, I mean, I've also heard you speak, about global warming, about how they're replacing a lot of the literature that's out in, it's been around for thousands of years, with these passages from the government. And you just talked about global warming. Why in the world are they getting rid of classic literature? What would be the reason for that? Because
classical literature, if you look at the great literature of Western history for the last 2,000 years, it's all of it, almost all of it's Judeo-Christian in values. All of the great Western writers, from Dante to Shakespeare to Milton to Chaucer to Toni Morrison, have been deeply imbued in the Judeo-Christian ethic. It's there. That's one reason it has to go. Number two, it advocates for a view of history that is not the progressive view of history. It warns about big government. It warns about books like 1984, books like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, books like Brave New World, Ayn Rand's books, right? They warn constantly of the dangers of a federal government that's out of control, to Big Brother, right? So you got to break that, right? You break the tradition, get them away from Judeo-Christian values, get them away from the notions of what it was that made America a free constitutional republic. That's one reason. But even more than that, you're replacing those Western classics with what they call, for lack of a better word, instructional texts, right? They're informational texts is what they call them. Their argument is, we want to prepare kids not necessarily for college, but for careers, for work. Which means they don't need to read Shakespeare, even though in Shakespeare they'll learn a lot about liberty, they'll learn a lot about individualism, they'll learn a lot about freedom. No. We don't want them to read that. We want them to read informational texts. So they're taking out the great literature and they're replacing it with non-literary texts in English class, many of which come directly from the federal government. And a lot of them, so instead in English class, instead of reading, great writers, great literature, poetry, plays, they're going to start reading a lot of pamphlets and informational texts, like many of them have to do with global warming. And it's all one-sided. All man-made global warming and how America is responsible for destroying the planet. They'll read no balance. They will read no informational text. And you asked the right question. So English now isn't about truth and beauty and reading about great inspiring lives. It's going to be much more about reading utilitarian documents that push a progressive, particularly a federal government progressive agenda.
So at this, go ahead. You going to say something else?
No.
Okay. At this point, what can people do?
You know, I've been doing this for 4 years. Mm-hmm. And I've reached the point where it's abundantly clear Common Core isn't going away. Even the so-called stalwart Republican governors, the Governor Walkers, the governor, the Jeb Bushes of the world, they're for it. The Kasichs, these tough-talking Republicans, they're not getting rid of it. In fact, they've done everything they can to conceal it from their constituents and to enshrine it. Federal government certainly isn't getting rid of this. The tests have all been rewritten. The billions of dollars have been spent. The only answer is to get your kids out of public school while you still can. It's the only answer. If you wait for the public schools to come back, they're not coming back. They're going to get worse, not better. Take advantage while you still have it of private schooling and homeschooling. I think the answer to all of this is homeschooling. The idea that, and when did this happen? When did the American people, because the founding fathers wisely never made any provision whatsoever for public schools. Why? Because they knew a federal government that was in charge of education would ultimately educate your kids towards the federal government, towards bigger government. They knew it. And for about 100 years now in this country, moms and dads have been dropping their kids off at federal government schools for 8 hours a day. I don't care how often you take your kids to church. I don't care if you pray with them every night. I don't care if you teach them on their own in the evenings. If you're giving them to government schools 8 hours a day, they will end up thinking things and believing things that you don't think and believe. The only real option, it seems to me, is to homeschool. In the last 10 years, we went from 1 million homeschool families to 3 million. It's the only hope you have of making sure your kids are getting good information, that you, the parent, have a meaningful say in what they're learning when. And by the way, you have to I'm sure you get this, that if we don't do anything else, if this continues unabated, what's going on at the federal level with education, how long is it before the feds prohibit homeschooling?
It seems like
if you're going to grow up all these kids, you're exactly right. They're already starting. Yeah. They're already nipping away at the corners of it, right? The best way to fight that is a strong homeschool movement. Look, I can just say this. Your parents, your parents and grandparents who are listening in the audience, they're your kids. Do what you want to do. If you think that this federal government has best interests at heart, if you think that all of this is benign and innocent, that the people in charge know what they're doing, then keep sending your kids to public school. If, however, you're dismayed at the fact that your kids grew up with a different set of worldviews than you do, that your kids view your patriotism, your faith, they look at it with contempt and bemusement, if the values that you really wished for your kids have all been taken from them, the only answer is homeschooling. Get your kids, get your grandkids, pull them out of these schools, find useful ways to homeschool them. If you don't do that, you're going to lose them.
Listen, I really appreciate you coming on here, Dr. Duke Pesta. Thank you very much for talking to everyone. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to put all the links at the bottom of this video, so if anyone wants to go find him, you'll just have to click on the link and you can go right to find him.
If there's anything else we can do, you want to talk some more or